Well, I want to welcome everybody to this session. Thank you for coming. My name is Lynn Jennings. I'm with the Education Trust. We're here to talk this morning about this really important topic around chronic absenteeism. We have a panel of experts here to give us everything from the data to what's happening to address this problem, something we don't want to become the new norm, with community partnerships, how to work with district leadership, and then, of course, what's happening in the states, what some of our state leaders are doing. So I want to make this informative, but also we hope this will be a conversation that we can have, because this will be an ongoing conversation that we need to continue to have as we address this issue in the future. So I'll start with I'll let the panelists introduce themselves. So I'll start with Nat. I'll start with you, my good friend over here from AEI, who is our researcher. You want to say more
Sure.
about yourself?
I'm Nat Malkus. I'm from the American Enterprise Institute. I do a lot of stuff with data, and since the pandemic started, have been tracking lots of things, including chronic absenteeism.
All right. Dr. Coons.
Lisa Coons, State Superintendent in the Commonwealth of Virginia.
Bib Hubbard, founder and president of Learning Heroes.
Hi, good morning. Renee Harvey, Vice President of the Cleveland Browns Foundation, and our foundation is laser focused on education and reducing chronic absenteeism.
All right. So we're going to go right into this and get started. And first, what we want to do is make sure we're setting the context. And so we're going to start with some of the data. And so I'm going to look to definitely Nat to get us started on this in terms of how is this a growing issue? What is with the surge of what's happening with educational outcomes? And very much what we're trying to get to is why this needs to be prioritized by states.
All right, so I usually bring a lot of slides, so buckle up. All the data that you're about to see is on our website, which is called returntolearntracker.org. And we've been tracking chronic absenteeism since the pandemic. I actually started tracking this because I thought this might be a good talking point, because I'm always so depressing when I talk about pandemic fallout, and this one might improve quickly. Alas, still unpopular at parties. So this is the 2017 data. On this scale, you see at the top, you want to be light orange, not dark red. The darkest spots are 50% chronically absent students. And that, again, chronic absenteeism, just to get our definition straight, that means a student missed 10% of the school year. If it's a full year, that's about 18 days or 2 days a month. 2017, a lot of states had this and reported this data. By 2018, we had the full range. And you can see some dark spots, but the thing to notice here that this is pretty stable. So I'm going to click to 2019, and you see a little bit of change. But at the state level, we're almost all within the same percentage point line. Pretty stable, but not a small problem. 15% of kids. So 1 in 6, 1 in 7, somewhere in there, missing 10% of the year. Not a good baseline. So that's just the first thing to understand. And then in 2020, right, well, we lost the last third of quarter of the year here, so I don't really trust this data. 2021 looks a little worse, but in 2021 we had closures, we had quarantines, we had sickness. Kind of hard to know exactly whether that data is right. And then it gets really red in 2022 when everyone was in school for the entire year generally. 90% higher across the board. That's 90% higher. That went from 15% to 28.4% of K-12 students missed 10% of the school year in 2022. We don't have full data for 2023. You can see some missing states, and you should talk about them badly after, because they should report this data. The good news here is that chronic absenteeism on the whole improved. It improved by about 2 points in what we're looking at. So that's from about 28.5 to about 26.3. And that's good, but you can see this as a glass half full or half empty. Remember, in this year, we're back in 2022. What happened during the pandemic? Omicron, right? The highest COVID levels that we've ever seen. Not so in 2023. And if chronic absenteeism, and it does, includes excused absences for sickness, then this 2-point gain doesn't seem that great. In 2024, this is 2023. 2024, we have a couple more states out there. Again, we have sort of the same trend. It's coming down, not nearly as quickly as we'd like. A couple of things about the nature of this data that is very important. We have to hold two ideas in our hands here at the same time. Okay, so for whom does this matter? It matters generally speaking, and this is data for the whole country. It includes about 42 million kids, 2018 and 2022 in blue and gold respectively, and we have high achieving districts. Again, there's about 13 million kids in those bars, and then low achieving districts on the bottom. And what do we see? So pre and post pandemic, disadvantaged kids had higher absenteeism. Okay. And we also see that the percentage point jump, right, is larger for disadvantaged students. So the low achievement students jumped about 17 points. That's much more than the 10 points that the high achieving students. Okay, this affects disadvantaged students at greater rates. However, look at the percentage increase. It doubled across the board. It's incredibly even. We talk about a rising tide because this affected everyone in relative terms. You can see that by achievement. You can see it by poverty. You can see it by urbanicity. We also gathered data on in-person instruction. So this is a smaller group, but it's still about 38 million kids. And the most remote districts are on the bottom. And if you squint, you can see a difference. But the reason that I put this in here, it wasn't the closures. It was the pandemic. The pandemic made the difference. So quickly, what's the latest data show? We only have so much for 2024. These are the states. Actually, there's 3 that released since the first day of this conference. But these are the ones that I sent in originally, and you can see the 23 data in orange. Almost across the board, it went down. That's good, not that much. And in 2024, we see some larger gains or improvements. New Mexico has an outsized improvement there. But what we don't see is a lot of states that have 2 years where they have large falls in a row. And so the question is, where are we headed? And I think the important thing to ask about this is where will the new normal be on chronic absenteeism? Now, I want to just ask quickly about why this is, answer the last thing that Lynn asked about why states should care about this. A lot of folks are very focused on pandemic learning loss. I still think that's very important. I think that the reason that states should focus on this is because there's no way to improve that pandemic learning loss that doesn't go through improving this chronic absenteeism. And if we don't have states laser focused on getting sort of these basic routines of schooling that underlie this absenteeism problem, then I don't see the improvements that we're looking for coming to pass. So let me yield back.
And I'll just add to that a little bit. That the other good news happened in 2024 is that at Trust, AEI, and TennisWorks had a partnership. This is just how big this is. That organizations like ours that perhaps don't always agree on strategies for addressing things, we all saw this as such a big issue, such a big problem, that we decided we needed to partner together to figure out how to make sure this rises to the and gets the attention that it needs. So I usually do a lot more talking on that, but I'm sure you'll come back to it. But I do want to put that out there, particularly given what we're doing, our political climate right now, that there are organizations that are working across lines, across aisles, everything on educational issues like this that are so important. All right. Dr. Coons, Virginia. We often highlight Virginia because of the proactive approach that your state has taken in addressing this problem. So would you please share with us, what are some of your recent efforts, what you've done? Give us some sense of the success and why Virginia has been so successful.
I think I want to start with the why. In 2023, when my team started boots on the ground analyzing our data, we were continuing to see gaps in our student performance. And so my amazing data team really dug into correlation. Is it our Southwest Virginia kiddos? Is it our economically disadvantaged kiddos? And we saw a one-to-one correlation with chronic absenteeism. And we heard Dan Heath speak just a little while ago about getting upstream. right? And as Nat said, we can work on learning loss, but if we don't get upstream and think about what is the fundamental spot we need to get before we can start thinking about learning loss and learning recovery, we had to think about attendance. What our data was showing last year in 2023 was that students scored on average 18 percentage points lower if they were chronically absent in reading and 25 percentage points lower in mathematics. That makes chronic absenteeism real. And then telling families that 2 days a month results in chronic absenteeism. So we had to change the message. Nat's message is super important for educators and for our school leaders and to talk in this community, but we had to change the message to our families and help our families actually understand and get upstream about why it was so important to bring your kiddos back to school and change that messaging. And we started that messaging with our governor. And our governor and our legislature came together and put all-in funding, which was $418 million into attendance, learning loss, and literacy. And each one of our school divisions had to create a plan on those three things and allocate their funds to that. And for the first time in Virginia, their plans were public and publicly posted on websites. And that was a critical moment to say we are putting a stake in the sand about attendance, and we're asking our schools to put a stake in the sand about how they're going to support attendance. And so that was a movement for us, and to have the governor speak to that and talk about not only are parents important and parents are partners, but parents are also responsible and have to bring their children to school, really started the shift for us in helping the post-pandemic message where it was, keep your kids at home, make sure they're healthy, to know it's so important for your kiddos to be at school. And so we moved through a lot of different strategies. We put together a statewide chronic absenteeism task force. That task force included health professionals because we wanted health professionals to understand the impacts of attendance. We had family members, we had school leaders, and from that task force, then we started spreading and scaling around opportunities for our schools. So we are on a long-term journey, but it started with looking at that data, thinking about how we shift that messaging from being very technical and very truancy focused to how important it is to have your child at school.
Renee, Ohio has adopted a comprehensive approach to reducing chronic absenteeism. How important do you think community partnerships have been in Ohio's strategy?
Great question. Appreciate everyone taking your time to be here today. Obviously, for reasons we've heard, huge issue that we all need to come to the table to help address. In Ohio, I feel we're very fortunate. As mentioned, we have a comprehensive approach as well. We have an initiative called Stay in the Game, which is a public-private partnership with our State Department of Educational Workforce, Harvard's Proving Ground, the Cleveland Browns Foundation. We now have 2 additional teams to help really span the entire state in the Columbus Crew, and FC Cincinnati. And then most recently, due to the success of the network and the growth and interest in the network, we have identified a new network host in Battelle. And so they're really able to take on the day-to-day operations. We have 3 full-time staff that are really dedicated to this. But I think what really makes this such a great initiative that is part of the state's, again, larger comprehensive approach to this is it's really meant to be positive, supportive, preventative, bringing an entire community together to support its students. And so much as what has been talked to already, but it's about the state agency, it's about educators and schools having responsibility in this in terms of having that sense of belonging and good, positive culture within the school buildings and the classrooms. It's about families and parents making sure that we're sending our kids to school on a regular basis. It's what we can do as a sports team to make that fun and exciting and cool. And so it's really trying to be, again, not waiting for our students to become chronically absent, but moving upstream and trying to make sure that we are focused on prevention and early intervention. And so far, that seems to be working. And to your point, Nat, community partners obviously play a tremendous role in that. We also had a task force that the department led, and that was comprised of many of the same partners that you had, in addition to the juvenile courts, but community partners, attendance experts, education leaders. They put forth a set of recommendations. And in that community partnerships piece, we have a really broad definition of what we consider community partners, but want to make sure that we understand that obviously when kids come to school, that's not their entire life. And many of the services that are offered by our community partners really help support that. So we can stay in our lane in terms of what we're each knowledgeable about, but we need to really lean on our community partners to help, whether that's, again, mental health experts, our out-of-school time providers, our libraries. There are so many different ways in which our community partners can help us, and that's really where we're going to see that sustainable results that we're all hoping for.
For public awareness, I got a thumbs up from the doorway on Lynn, so I think that she's going to be in okay shape, and our thoughts are with her. Bib, to you, your family and community engagement impact study found some lessons about how important family engagement can be to this. That may not be surprising, but I want to hear the details.
Yeah, thank you. So just for a little context, at Learning Heroes, we work to strengthen the relationship between schools and homes, parents and teachers, to advance student learning and well-being. We believe that families can act as sort of a binding mechanism in terms of all of the instructional strategies that are taking hold to drive student outcomes. So with that perspective and context, we partnered with TNTP to understand the role of family engagement pre-pandemic in outcomes post-pandemic. And so to do that, we went to Illinois. The state of Illinois has a longitudinal survey that is conducted annually amongst schools. It's called the 5 Essentials, meaning like there are 5 essential components that make a good school. And one of the 5 essentials is called an involved family score. So we looked at the involved family score, the schools that rated themselves, so it's teachers reporting on their own experience, but that rated themselves really highly in family engagement. So they were in the 90th percentile on the involved family score. And then we looked at the schools who rated themselves really poorly on family engagement in the 10th percentile. And we found some really staggering outcomes and differences. So as it relates to chronic absenteeism, as you saw from Nate's really awesome slides, chronic absenteeism increased across the board. But the schools, the 90th percentile schools had lower chronic absenteeism rates by 39% than the 10th percentile schools. We also saw increased attendance in those 90th percentile schools. We saw the achievement rates. They didn't lose as much achievement rates. Everybody sort of lost ground on ELA and math. But the schools with 90th percentile similarly had better achievement rates. So we're seeing really strong results around family engagement as a strategy to address chronic absenteeism, to address achievement, to address feeling comfortable, feeling welcome in your school. So it makes sense, but to have the data is super helpful. And that was our phase 1 findings. So we are literally in phase 2. So stay tuned. Hopefully I can come back next year and share what we find in phase 2, which is understanding what are the strategies that these 90th percentile schools were implementing versus the 10th percentile schools, so that we can then share the data for what good family engagement looks like.
So there's a question here for me. What role does data collection and analysis play in understanding the root causes, and how can states better leverage this data? There's a couple of things to know about the data. You're not going to find anybody who values it more highly than me. I play in it all day long and report it regularly. So I think it's essential, and I think that there's a couple of ways that it's essential. First of all, if you're working at the district level, you can certainly sort of target students because you have the data to do that, and I think that's extremely essential. But that takes resources and work. And at the state level, I think it's very important, as Dr. Kuhn said, we need to identify the issues that are our top priorities. And I think that is the priority that states can set up so that districts can use their sort of more fine-grained data to do this. So a lot of it is about issue elevation at the district level. It's about targeting our resources to where they can have the most effect. However, I also think that when we look at what happened over the pandemic, and I didn't have, they limited the number of slides, so I didn't have this one, but there's a big question about where this is going to settle back down. And the difference between pre-pandemic and post-pandemic chronic absenteeism is huge, and it's widespread. So the question on what can state leaders do with the data, I really think it is important to elevate this such that it can actually pierce the consciousness of folks who have kids and are not paying attention to this. And that is a very tall order. So this is part of the reason that Attendance Works and Ed Trust and me at AEI have set up this challenge at the state level, asking states to commit to cut chronic absenteeism by 50% over 5 years. We had 14 states that have already signed up for that, and there's many others that are talking about it, about the next round. I think it's important because I think governors are essential, again, as Dr. Kuhn said, and it's not a data game at that point. It is a game of using the data to highlight the priorities, to make sure that we sort of have all hands on deck, and that we do that over a sustained period, because this is a long game. And then the last thing I will say is that I do think that one thing states can do is set up dashboards. Indiana just revamped theirs a little while ago. Rhode Island has been sort of leading the pack on this, and these are not the only ones. But I do think that setting those up to make sure the data are clear and open are helpful. I also think that there are laggards. And those laggards are folks who are releasing the data on what I think is the most important issue in chronic absenteeism a year or more after the end of the school year. And I think that's unacceptable. And I think that if you're in a state where that's going on, you should let them know that. So let me get off my soapbox. Renee, I have another question for you about the data. The development of Ohio student recovery dashboards has been an important part of the state strategy. What are some of the key components there, and what do you think makes it click?
So to your point, the state did develop the recovery dashboard, and I think for us, the transparency is incredibly important. That mindset shift still needs to happen, and so that dashboard really breaks down chronic absenteeism year over year, but it also breaks down, you can look at it by district, you can also see it by certain student groups, so that then we can act. I think that piece has been pivotal. The Department of Education has also allocated a quarter of a full-time employee towards really focusing on attendance-related data. So making sure we continually mine for that information, drawing the parallels and the connection between chronic absenteeism and academic achievements. And we have some of that information that we're then able to act on. So what I would also say is, in addition to that piece, we're being really intentional about training our education service centers. There is, for our regional data leads, there is an attendance data certification. So those supports can be really allocated across the state to really help at the district level to raise that. And then through Stay in the Game, what we do is we have a very robust online playbook that our districts need to fill out. And as part of that, they do a data analysis of what's happening locally in their district. We also ask them to add in their quarterly attendance goals, but also go back and add the actuals across the categories that our friends at Attendance Works helped us outline. So we really want to make sure that we're not only paying attention to students who are chronically absent, but we want to start seeing those shifts upwards through the categories from severe all the way up to at risk. And obviously we want to get them into that satisfactory category, which is where we want all of our students. So I think the combination of seeing some of that at the state level, what are the supports we can offer to our districts, and then what locally can the districts see and act on. All of that, coupled with, we have evaluations. We had a third-party evaluation that we were able to receive some ESSER funding to support, to identify that the districts who are in network for us, are they seeing results? Is this moving the needle? And what we're finding is the districts who are really seeing that change management and getting that buy-in across their districts, and it's not just living with one person at the district level, but they're really building that down into school building level, are seeing greater gains. And so all of that. We also have some policy work that we need to probably lean on as well, that we're getting from the feedback from our attendance task force as well. But all of that data really just helps make sure that we're headed in the right direction, and obviously making some data-informed decisions so we know where to really lean in.
Dr. Coons, in Virginia, you have an attendance task force. You developed an action kit. At the state level, you're pushing folks and giving them tools. What are the primary goals there? And when you try and push around schools and districts to respond from the state level, how's that fair?
Well, I think this is a comprehensive approach. We had to have the governor put the stake in the sand and make the message. But then we have to come alongside of our school districts to make sure they have the tools and resources. So we did a multi-layered approach. We started with this governor's task force to look at 5 things, and we really focused on transportation, we focused on breakfast after the bell, we focused on barriers such as health and mental health, engaging families and students, and making sure that those were the 5 things that we really wanted to do in the first year. And that is what national data was saying. Those were the strategies at a high level. We wanted to anchor our schools around and give them a pathway to make change. And we wanted to make sure that they had that opportunity. So we had the Chronic Absenteeism Task Force focus on those 5 things, had conversations with national experts, had live stream, recorded those, put those on our website as that first layer of awareness for our school districts, our principals, our teachers, and then we built an action kit around those 5 strategies. And then we rolled that out to superintendents. We rolled that out in symposiums, and they are probably tired of our 5 strategies over and over and over again to make sure that our schools had an ability to start the work. And so that was really important to us in year 1. We also took 200 principals in our high-need schools and really dug into the data and really started working with them and layered in that data work to make sure they were getting very specific. This year, we've shifted to dig in a layer further and help our data teams really dig into the data work that you're talking about. What is your data telling? And we're modeling that. Our statewide data says kindergarten, 7th grade, and 11th grade. Our statewide data says our homeless students are by far where we need to lean in. So we're modeling that for our school districts, modeling the strategy, modeling the data work, but then giving them the tools to go in, because what it looks like in Northern Virginia is very different than Southwest Virginia, very different than the Tidewater area, and we need them, as you talked about, to really dig in and look at their data, but we need to model that and come along shoulder to shoulder. We are really jealous of Rhode Island and Indiana and their data dashboard, and are working furiously to build something that is transparent and hopeful. And then we have started to focus on teacher attendance and thinking about a campaign in our year 2. I've got some awesome teachers from Virginia. Shout out to y'all who are here. We are very excited to have teacher leadership here, but our teachers are critical, and we know that having a great teacher in the classroom every day is part of that engagement, part of that excitement that a child has to come to school. So we need to start thinking about making sure our teachers know how important they are, and that our teachers coming to school every day really matters. So we continue to evolve and shift, but we need to come alongside and mentor and model those opportunities for our school districts, and then dig in where those highest need points are. And I think you said that really well. It's about the data. And the more data we have, the faster to the data, the faster we're able to look and come alongside is really important to us. So that's a key strategy for Virginia.
So, quick follow-up. You put out a lot of these things. It's often hard to figure out, well, is it actually working? So do you have any evidence? Is it working?
Yep. So I'm really proud of our data team, and they've really looked and highlighted and featured, to Dan Heath's point about bright spots. We are really looking at our bright spots and seeing where our work has impacted some of our great winners last year in attendance. We have some high schools who have dropped from 34% to 8%. We're like, what'd you do? Wow. What did you do? And then we looked at their all-in plan and said, what was your strategy? Oh, you have an attendance engagement person who worked on family engagement. Okay, so how do we elevate that? So it is working. We just have to continue to have better data tools to know more specifically where our return on investment is happening.
Bib, you've done some work on the barriers that families face and students face. that these certainly are going to affect regular attendance. How can leaders address the challenges that they're finding, which I'm sure do vary from Northern Virginia to Southwest Virginia to different contexts? But how do you understand them?
So cue the slide. I got one slide. I'm also like Nat. I like my slides. You can just go all the way through. So as we think about sort of, Lisa's articulated some amazing solutions, but to back up and think about some of the main barriers. So you can see here a key barrier for us in 2016. When we surveyed parents nationally, we found that 9 out of 10 parents, regardless of race, income, or education level, perceive their child's at or above grade level in reading and math. So that was in 2016. Flash forward to the pandemic, we're like, surely that's going to change. And it did change a little bit. This is from 2023, last November, actually. We partnered with Gallup, and now 88% of parents, regardless of race, income, or education level, who think their child's at or above grade level. And parents also report that their children are getting Bs. So 80% of parents say their children are getting all Bs or above. And for a parent, a good grade equals grade level. So of course, my fourth grader bringing home an A or a B in fourth grade reading must be reading out of fourth grade. That's not the case. But we forgot to tell parents that that child is just turning in her homework, she's asking good questions, she's doing all the good things, but she's reading at a second grade level. So a key barrier for chronic absenteeism, we believe, is this inflated view that parents have of their child's achievement. Because if your child comes and says, I'm not feeling well, or I'm intimidated, or whatever the reason is, you're more likely to say, okay, you can stay home because you're getting a B. You're going to be fine. It's okay. So this is one big barrier. And you can see on the slide, there's a TEDx talk that my colleague and friend and co-founder, Cindy Williams, did, which I encourage everybody to check out. The QR code, you can just take a little picture and access it really easily. But she goes into this story much more deeply and personally. So again, I encourage you. But parents aren't asking their teachers, is my child on grade level? Because the relationships often aren't there. Virginia is making incredible strides to partner up parents and teachers in service of student learning and well-being. So really exciting to see the work that's happening there. It's just not happening broadly enough. So one big barrier is just this inflated perception. And then, as you've heard, transportation. One example, we actually released a blog today. So myself, Hetty Chang from Attendance Works, Ralph Smith from the Campaign for Grade Level Reading, Todd Rogers from Everyday Labs. Check it out on LinkedIn. But one of the stories that emerged was a mom from Baltimore, and she has a son who's a second grader, Keon, and he's got chronic asthma. And for her to get him to school, she has to take 3 modes of public transportation. So she's got to hop on the subway, then she's got to get on a bus, and then she has to finally get on like a light rail to get her child to school. So not only, and he has, chronic asthma. So between the health barriers, the transportation barriers, he was missing a lot of school. But her school does partner up in really meaningful ways. So she felt comfortable asking the principal for help. So they have given her a public transportation pass. So she now no longer has to pay to get her child to school. So he's now going to school more often. She's seeing incredible results, as we can all imagine. But transportation, it's easy to sort of say, but it really is a huge barrier. And I love that you are hitting that on head on, so that's really important. And just the relationships between schools and families, as we've talked about. So as we think about the strategies for, in addition to some of the wonderful ideas, not ideas, but like actions you guys are already taking, providing coaching. So people, like for states and districts, coach principals on how to think about families as assets and allies in student learning and well-being. How can families be a part of your instructional strategy, your vision for the school? Coach your teachers. It's really intimidating for teachers to talk to families. When we survey teachers, the 3 reasons they cite for not having kind of difficult conversations with families is based in fear. I'm afraid I'm not going to be believed. I'm afraid I'm going to be blamed. And I'm afraid my principal's not going to have my back. So you can see that teachers aren't able to develop those relationships with parents as easily as you would think. Oftentimes, parents are kept outside of the school building. It's time for us to find ways to bring them in and partner up. And I know you will see good results from that. So those are some, just the coaching, and then providing families with the practical tools, the language that they can use to talk to teachers. So again, we have a bunch of tools on our website. Like there's a Mad Libs for families. If you know what Mad Libs is, you just kind of fill in the blank to tell a story. So families can introduce themselves to teachers. So, dear teacher, here's what my child likes to do. Here's what they hate doing. Here's where my family is from. So just offering a little bit of information so the teacher starts to build that relationship. Home visits. I mean, there are so many tools in our toolbox to help build those relationships and strengthen them that can, help address chronic absenteeism, achievement, multiple factors, attendance, I would say teacher retention, principal retention. So families can be just an essential strategy they are often overlooked. So really excited to be able to partner with states like Virginia, and hopefully we can partner with you now that we've been introduced to bring families into this into the process.
And I'll just piggyback on the perception. I think it's key. I was talking with Lisa earlier. We're doing some work on chronic absenteeism and graduation rates, and it's very difficult to do all the detailed statistical stuff. It's a challenge. But look, the basic lesson is pretty clear. Over the pandemic, chronic absenteeism went up 90%, and graduation rates continued to rise. I mean, the disconnection on the perception in just those two things is a little bit astonishing. I have a question for me here on the role that state-level policies can play in addressing chronic absenteeism and whether there's some successful strategies. I mean, look, I think the successful strategies question, the jury's still out. It doesn't mean that there's nothing that states can do. I just don't know exactly. I'm not going to come and say, well, it's this and that. I don't know that to be true. I do think on the perception front, it's important for states to play a role for a lot of the reasons that Bib was talking about, because we need leadership on this issue to pierce the sort of understanding of what's going on. So we're sending school the perception with grades and with graduation rates and with feedback to parents that, well, things aren't really that out of control, even though we know that learning loss is dramatic, and we know that chronic absenteeism is not only bad for students, but at the rates that we're seeing now, where lots and lots and lots of schools are over 30%. 35%. I mean, this is a disruptor to the production function of schooling. You can't have good schooling without these routines. So how do we push back on this? And I think, again, it's important to see, how did these changes come about? Now, some of this is the elevation of barriers, but the change that we saw over the pandemic, I think largely or dramatically came from these powerful messages that we sent home. What were those messages? It's not always safe to be in school. And we had some real salience to back up these messages. Don't come to school as readily because people might get sick and some people might die. That was appropriate, but the problem is that we never had very salient messages that came back and said, that period is over. It is time to pivot back to coming to school more regularly. The sniffles should not keep you at home. The permission structure that loosened up about missing school, we must now pull back. We need to change those routines. Okay, that sounds like a reasonable thing as sort of a point of attack, but how does one do that? And I don't think you can do that without the state taking a leadership role. Who else is going to speak into this with enough sort of moral clarity than the governor? It really has to be the governor. And so that is, Governor Youngkin has leaned in. There's a number of governors you can say this, but I can't say that every governor has done it by any means.
I can't say that either of the presidential candidates mentioned it at all. And, I think that is a real problem. So I think that the folks in the room, and admittedly everyone that I talk to, should amplify the importance of getting back to the routines that we know were possible. So I don't want to take up too much time, but I do want to talk about this 50% cut. That is a very ambitious goal. But a couple of the reasons that we want people to do it are we think that it works across the board. So there were a bunch of districts that had much higher chronic absenteeism pre-pandemic than others. We get that. But a 50% cut for the vast majority of them says we need to push back on this, and that pre-pandemic absenteeism wasn't enough. And I think the other key that it's important that, and the logic to this that we think that our state partners are grasping onto, is they're setting a long-term goal with some urgency, one that we can track and one that will sustain the gains over time until we actually pull it down. Because the gains over the past couple of years were the easiest. It does not get easier as this problem becomes more normalized. And so I really think that's the danger zone that we are in. And that's why state leadership is important. But when you mentioned the principals wonder, or the teachers are wondering, will the principal have my back? I think that if the teachers are wondering about the principal, I think the principals might be wondering that about their superintendent. And I think the superintendent might be wondering that about the state soup. And that's why I think that we need absolutely clear leadership from the top to make this a priority so that we can sort of have that waterfall all the way down. We have a few more minutes of questions, but then we're going to take questions from the audience. There's a microphone right here, so get ready. I'm in charge now, I guess. So at least at AEI, we have 2 rules for asking a question, and so I'm going to ask you to do those. First, give us your name, and second, ask a question. So that'll be in just a few minutes. The final question to all 3 of you: what do you think are the most important takeaways for state ed leaders who are focused on reducing chronic absenteeism, and how should they think about their priorities moving forward? And let's start with the state leader.
Well, Nat, I've heard you say this many times. Attendance is one of the most critical situations for education that we are facing today. And I think that's a really important statement for state leaders to say. As you said, we have to back up our superintendents, who back up our principals, who back up our teachers. But I think there is a shifting role for state leaders, not just to back superintendents up and make sure you have clear and consistent stake in the sand around important issues. It's to resource them. We have school districts who are very small, very rural, and dealing with a whole lot of things. So where are the tools? Where are the toolkits? But where are the messaging campaigns? And so as a state, we have to put those messaging campaigns together. We have to put packages for teachers to talk to families. We have to put social media placards that they can turnkey. So it's not just about the messaging and the communication and the stake in the sand, but it's also about resourcing. Our rurals are, because those are where our attendance gaps typically tend to be. Our more resourced school districts have attendance clerks, they have transportation strategies, they have breakfast after the bell, they have packages. And so our schools that are under-resourced need us to come alongside and put those resources in place and not just say this is something that's important. We also have to come along side by side and help you. And that is a shift in the perception of what states need to do, but it's critically important for state leaders to put priorities in place because everything under the sun is hitting schools. Everything from Medicaid to school safety, right? So we have to help schools focus. We have to help them get upstream, focus on what is the most critical issue, and then resource and support them to make sure that they can come along and do what's right for their families, for their kiddos, and make sure that we're putting great spaces for kiddos.
Dib, same question.
Just building on Lisa's comment, I would say setting expectations at the state and district level, and again, leaning into what you were saying, that considering families as co-designers of their children's education, and but doing that in a way because they're not taught how to do that. There is no curriculum for family engagement in pre-service. So some do it well, but it's because it's intuitive. But there is science against it. There is evidence against it. So supporting principals with coaching principals, supporting teachers, giving them the time, the tools, the training to do this work, to invite families in, to really listen to families, and not just the families that show up, but your whole school community. So I think it starts with expectations and looking for ways to engage families authentically and not just as sort of a check the box. We did that.
I would completely agree with my colleagues. And I would say for Ohio, we have the state leadership in terms of our governor and our state director of educational workforce. So I think that is pivotal in order to really influence the focus and the direction that needs to be placed on this. I think the campaign and the messaging piece also is incredibly important because it gets everyone on the same page using the same vernacular. Kind of focused on those same end goals, the data, layering in the data piece so that we can hold ourselves accountable at every level. And then the other piece for me that I think is really important, we talk about everyone having a role, but being very explicit about how are you either contributing to chronic absenteeism or how are you helping to reduce and alleviate that. So our healthcare professionals, are we only having office hours or clinical hours during the school day? Are we offering times in the evenings and the weekends? Even a neighbor, are we shoveling our walks so kids don't have to walk in a busy street to get to school? So everyone really being clear about how every single person, every single organization can contribute and play a role. How are we lining up our resources together because we're all serving the same kids, the same families?
Mm-hmm. Can I just say one other thing? Just as a note, the Ad Council just released a playbook around messaging and how to talk about chronic absenteeism with families. So I just wanted to flag that for you. I encourage, there's a report and a playbook, and then they also give a deep data dive. So it's fascinating research. But the key messaging guidance are three things, not super surprising, but good to know. And Lisa mentioned this as well, but be positive. Like the deficit-based approach, the punitive approach does not work. So just thinking about how to engage around this topic through a very positive lens, like what are the benefits that your child's going to get by going to school? And in particular, the benefits they're looking for the most is around the social and emotional. They get that being in person creates the opportunity for kids to get to know each other, to build friendships, to be able to work in teams. Like parents get that. And see school as an important place for the development of their social and emotional skills. So leaning into those kinds of messages is really effective. And then being realistic. So when a lot of the messaging they tested was, make sure your kid comes to school every day. And parents are like, that's actually not realistic. Like, I know there are going to be some days where my kid can't make it to school. So I don't want to feel badly about that. So rather than leaning into like the numbers of days and all of that, just being realistic, like get your kid to school consistently, make it, just make it a priority, but not to get into sort of like this unrealistic expectation that they can't possibly meet. So those are just kind of three themes that emerged, and again, encourage everybody to check it out. It's a wonderful piece of research that was supported by the Overdeck Family Foundation.
So I'll take my last comments, and Viv, I appreciate that, but I'm actually going to disagree a little bit with the Ad Council take. The thing that I will leave is how big a priority this should be, and I think that the approach that, on the one hand, and I've had lots of conversations with Lynn about this, what do we mean when we say the punitive approach doesn't work? I think there are studies that say if you take kids who are already in truancy court, that truancy court doesn't actually change the state for those things. However, we have seen that there are not what some people might call punitive, but they're just basic consequences within school. Not suspensions. That's ridiculous, right? Let's suspend them for not coming to school. But some consequences are going to be essential in this. And I think that it's if we're coming up against the greatest challenge in public schools, and we say we have to be wholly positive, and if we build it, they will come, I think we're tying one hand behind our back. And I think there's very reasonable things that vice principals across the nation enforce every day, and I think that's part of the playbook. And I think that if we try and come at this with only sort of positive supports, when we see that across the board people are they are coming to school less, we're not able to counter the same thing that you and I experience at work when people don't come in as much. But here's the key thing: it hurts kids more. It's going to hurt kids more. We know this. And so for that reason, we have to bring every tool in our toolkit onto this problem. So I really think that it's important to prioritize it and bring every resource out there.
Well,
okay.
Just to clarify,
absolutely.
These were messaging points. These were not actual strategies. This is just how to communicate broadly about the importance of being in school. So when you look at the Ad Council data, it does not address any of the actual consequences programmatically.
Sure.
Just to clarify.
Fair enough. So we have some questions. First one.
Hi, good morning. Haley Corman from Bellwether. I'm with you on the seriousness and urgency of this problem, and I think there's two things happening. There's one about the ways in which we talk with families, but there's also the ways in which we talk with policymakers. And do you think policymakers understand that this is, in my opinion, a generational policy crisis in the making, and what we can see not 5 years from now, but 15 years from now and 30 years from now? Do people really grasp that? And if not, what do you think it would take for them to understand the seriousness of the moment we're in?
I would say no. We are working on our early childhood work and our subsidy programs and the importance of attendance versus enrollment in our subsidy programs with our policymakers. And we are having a really hard time helping our policymakers understand the value of a child care subsidy seat. They just want them to be enrolled. And we're like, no, attendance actually is critically important. Look at our K-1-2 data, look at our K-1-2 data and the correlation between that. And to your point about how do we get there, we have to show impact. And we have to show impact with some of the data. I think policy is that interesting bridge. You have to show some of data that Nat shared, but you also have to share the messaging that you share with families and public about this is what happens, 19% lower in reading, 26% lower in math, right? You have to show the impact in the through line with your policymakers. But I would say very clearly in our work around early childhood and subsidy, our policymakers are not. And we've done a lot of work from the state level, and getting that message is really important.
I would just say that there's variation across states. Some are doing better than others. Some are not on the field on this issue. And yes, they will have it 15 years later. I believe that's going to be a problem. Anybody else, or should we move to the next one?
Good morning. My name's Joe Hollings. I work with an after-school organization called Open Doors Academy in northern Ohio. Go Browns. I'm curious to know, we serve about 1,900 kids, primarily in low-income areas, and we've recently completed 3 studies with school districts that we serve to show that kids in our program attend school more than those that don't. And I'm curious to know what data is out there that shows the impact of after-school programs on attendance.
So I'll just take this quickly. I mean, we do see that there's a chicken and the egg thing here. So yes, we do see that kids that participate in after-school programs that can be related to improvements. But the question is it that they are engaged with after-school programs and thus are also engaged with school, or are they engaged at school and attend regularly because of? And I think that that kind of evaluation work takes time, and so it's uncertain how the causal arrows go. I do think that there are aspects of schooling that can make the difference, but I think that we should be very honest about a couple of things about the state of chronic absenteeism research. The vast majority of it is from before the pandemic. And before the pandemic, we were dealing with a different beast. So we're working to try and do that. Other folks are working to try and do that. I think urgency on that front is important. And I also think that we don't really have time to wait for the evaluations to come out before we act. So to some degree, and I usually don't say this kind of thing, but to some degree, take your best play, be thoughtful about it, but be active rather than waiting. Anybody else?
No, I think the only thing I would say, I can't really speak to the data as well, but what I would say is I think for us, we see engagement, whether kids are excited going to school and there's maybe a really great robotics class or something after school, that opens them up and hopefully building additional relationships, because we know how important that adult relationship is. So whether that's the school building, out of school time provider, for us it's great because there's hopefully a connection and communication line that's coming back to the school and helping connect those families to services and support. So if that relationship and connection point comes from out of school time or in school, I think it's a win.
Hi, Angie Gallo. I'm a school board member in Orange County, Florida. So I have like a two-part question. The first one is Virginia and Ohio. With all the good work you're doing around chronic absenteeism, do you have a set definition of absenteeism and chronic absenteeism in your state? Because you have to have that first before you could collect the data and the data is valid. And then my second part of that question is, do you include teachers in that data? Because there's a lot of research out there that says it's not just about the kids being absent, it's about pulling teachers out for professional development and having teachers out of the classroom. There's a loss of instruction, a loss of learning when that happens.
Yep. Yes, that was one of the first things we needed to do, was define and clearly remind. Again, Nat talked about pre-pandemic, post-pandemic, and the messaging around the pandemic. Attendance became this fluid gray in front of a computer, here some, not some. So yes, I think you had to redefine it for schools and for families and help families understand that importance and that definition. But I also think for us, it's less about that punitive language around teachers. It's about the importance of the teacher. And you talked about that relationship and that opportunity. That teacher matters, and that teacher being there matters. So that's part of our work now in the second year, is the importance and the value of the teacher in the classroom and the importance of the teacher being there as well. I think those both things are really critical and be important. Thank you for elevating that.
Yeah, I don't think I would completely agree with that as well. Ohio has an attendance guidebook, and that really, to your point, kind of outlines the definition. So again, we're all starting from the same place in terms of how we're talking about it, how we're viewing it. And I think another piece in that guidebook that was really important, or our playbook, is any time away from school, excused, unexcused, suspensions, is missed learning time. And so we really grounding ourselves in some of those same concepts, and that framework was really important.
I'll just add a little bit from the data side. I almost never compare one state to another, because their data collection regimes are different. So what does this percentage mean versus that percentage? It doesn't mean the same thing. In California, it's district by district how they set their attendance definitions. That said, most of these attendance regimes, these data collection, whatever, the machine that collects the data doesn't change that much year to year, and every single state saw the same sort of scale of relative increase. Now, some are worse than others, that's true, but they all jumped like crazy in 2022. So despite the uncertainty in the data and the incomparability from state to state, the changes is real. On the teacher question, there are some states that have teacher attendance data. We have it for all of them that would give it to us, and so I think it's somewhere around 11 states we have it for. I don't have the slides here, but I can. We haven't published it. It's up. It's not as up as it appears for student chronic absenteeism or ADA rates in comparison. However, students don't have contracts that sort of police that, so your mileage may vary on those comparisons, but I think it's vital. I'll just leave with a last word because we're out of time for question. I think the importance of understanding where we are in this cycle is vital. right? So we've had a couple of years. We're still not quite sure where it was last year. But in sort of the social science, they'll say these behaviors, they sort of are frozen, and then they unfreeze, and then they change. We've seen those two pieces, but we haven't seen where this refreezes. And the action now, I think, will have material consequences about whether the national rate, and the rates that's made up of rates in your state and district, end up 20% higher. That's at like 19% of kids, 20% of kids, or whether it's closer to 18 or hopefully 15% again, or even better. And I think that awareness now and action now is going to define the new normal, and that should activate urgency on this issue. So thanks for showing up. And
Just one thing.
we have one quick announcement. Yes.
Yeah, so first of all, thank you to our amazing panel.